You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 22nd of November, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
How many of his cabinet picks can US President-elect Donald Trump actually get confirmed? How much trouble is his Brazilian equivalent, former President Jair Bolsonaro, actually in? And how has China come so far, so fast? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers who believed they'd be left alone for the rest of the year if they wearily agreed to it this week are Tomos Lewis and Fernando Augusto Pacheco. They'll discuss the day's stuff and introduce the new edition of The Entrepreneurs, and we'll hear from the author Oriana Skylar Mastro about her new book chronicling the rapid rise of China. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. In the United States this week, President-elect Donald Trump has made his first stumble over his own shoelaces as he strides towards his second inauguration. His somewhat startling pick for U.S. Attorney General, former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, withdrew from consideration for the role after it appears to have become apparent that even a Trump-friendly Senate was unlikely to confirm someone of Gaetz's, what we will call, proclivities. Trump has now swapped in former Florida Attorney General and mispronounced beach Pam Bondi, who at least as of this broadcast has not been herself undone by any revelations of a shareholding in a badger-baiting ring or similar. I'm joined with more by Washington, D.C. reporter Simon Marks. Simon, there are, of course, any amount of speculations and prognostications, some of them extremely amusing, swirling around Matt Gaetz's withdrawal from consideration. Do we know what the reason actually was? Was it the thing where he just went to try and curry favour with the Senate and they all just told him, get out of here?
Well, I think it was absolutely clear that he went to meet these Republican senators and over the course of several hours, meeting several of them, realised that there was absolutely no way. Privately, they were telling him that they would confirm. But the timing of his withdrawal also appears to have been related to a CNN investigation that uncovered a second occasion on which Matt Gaetz allegedly was having sex with an underage woman. And when CNN went to Matt Gaetz for a comment on that finding, Gaetz refused to comment and 45 minutes later announced that he was withdrawing from the race. So there may well be some causality between CNN unearthing that second allegation and Matt Gaetz exiting the race. For, of course, the Republicans on Capitol Hill, his departure was splendid news because now they don't have to worry about him anymore. They've got plenty of other nominees still to concern themselves with. Oh,
well, indeed. I mean, it is nice to know they do have some standards when it comes to sexual predators, occupying high public office. But can we possibly imagine on that subject that President-elect Trump was surprised that Gaetz crashed and burned?
No, I think that Matt Gaetz was always going to be an unbelievably high bar for Donald Trump to meet. I mean, it has been a while in Washington, D.C. since any piece of news created collective laughter shared by Democrats and Republicans alike. But that was the response to Matt Gaetz's nomination. I mean, this was a man who absolutely was entirely unqualified for the position of Attorney General, with the single caveat that he was willing to do Donald Trump's bidding. Donald Trump needs a pliant Attorney General if he's going to strip the Department of Justice of its traditional independence and then order his Attorney General to go after his political enemies. And in that regard, and that regard only, Matt Gaetz filled the bill. But the effort to try and get him through confirmation was never going to work. Matt Gaetz himself gave an interview to Newsmax TV in August of last year, conceding that he wanted one day to become Attorney General, but that it would be impossible for him to get confirmation. So he understood that, and the Trump people understood that. It may well be that Donald Trump was looking for a sacrificial lamb, because if you lose Matt Gaetz, you can then say, right, I'm now drawing a line all the others, they've got to be confirmed. And certainly Trump operatives on Capitol Hill are delivering that message. There are warnings to Republicans in the Senate from people like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. She of the belief that Jewish space lasers are responsible for forest fires in California, that if Senate Republicans block any of these appointments, Elon Musk's political war chest will be unleashed against them, and they will face primary challenges when they come up for re-election at their next date with political destiny. So there's a warning there, and there's a threat of retribution against Republicans in the Senate if they don't, as Marjorie Taylor Greene puts it, recognize Donald Trump's mandate.
So do we have to assume then that all of his other picks are going to be confirmed? Because to understate matters wildly, there are question marks about a few of them, notably Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health, and Tulsi Gabbard, and even to say it out loud, as actual Director of National Intelligence, the most powerful intelligence official in the democratic world, whose relationship with Russia and whose attitudes towards Russia would very probably prevent her from getting security clearance to serve in literally any other role.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a woman of whom Hillary Clinton claimed in 2015, when they were both seeking the Democratic Party's presidential nomination at the time, that Tulsi Gabbard was being groomed by Russia. She's absolutely the Kremlin's favorite former congresswoman. News of her nomination was greeted with glee on Russian state television. I think the nomination that's in difficulty is probably Pete Hegseth, the Fox News breakfast time TV host that Trump wants to send to run the Pentagon, because he's also got skeletons in his closet regarding the alleged assault of a woman who the allegations that a woman brought against him for sexual assault, and he then paid her off. And there's more reportorial digging going on into that at the moment, and it could derail his hopes of becoming Pentagon chief. But I think many of the others, I mean, Linda McMahon, the former Worldwide Wrestling Federation executive who is tipped to become the education secretary, Tulsi Gabbard, even Matt Whitaker, the former acting attorney general, a man with absolutely no foreign policy qualifications whatsoever, nominated for the post of NATO ambassador. I think a lot of those are likely to go through because Republicans are under pressure to recognize the scale of Donald Trump's election win, that he was being given a mandate to do all the things that he said he was going to do. And while all of these people are wildly out of the ordinary in any previous government, they absolutely fit in terms of what Donald Trump vowed that he would be doing, putting together a government of Make America Great Again loyalists in an effort to make sure that this time round he doesn't get derailed by Washington careerists.
I just want to come back to his new pick for Attorney General, because early on when he started naming people, like, for example, presumptive Secretary of State Marco Rubio, people were thinking, well, OK, that's not too crazy. You can imagine pretty much any other Republican who might be president-elect nominating somebody like Rubio. It's not a completely preposterous thought. Does Pam Bondi fit that description? Is she actually remotely qualified to serve as U.S. Attorney General?
She's more qualified than Matt Gaetz was.
So am I.
mean, she served as 18 years as a prosecutor in Florida, then rose to the ranks of being Attorney General. She's very much in the Trump fold. At one point, she was considering joining New York in bringing legal action on behalf of the state of Florida against Trump University, received a $25,000 campaign contribution from the Trump Foundation, and miraculously...
That sounds fine.
...then decided not to join the state of Florida in pursuing Trump University. But she's definitely got a much greater degree of legal expertise than Matt Gaetz has got. And in many ways, it's surprising that she wasn't the first choice rather than the second second choice, because if you really were determined to get stuff done without having all of this controversy and all of this other stuff dragging people's attention, you might think that Pam Bondi would fit that bill. So those people who were celebrating Matt Gaetz's departure may rue the day if she indeed does become Attorney General, because she will go about doing all of the things that Matt Gaetz was willing to do, and she'll do it without an awful lot of distraction, causing difficulties for the Trump administration, as far as we currently understand things.
Just finally, Donald Trump is at least to be spared, it seems, one legal difficulty. We were scheduled to be presented with next week the spectacle of the President-elect of the United States turning up in a New York City courthouse to be sentenced. Apparently not so.
Definitely not going to happen next week, and almost certainly not going to happen this side of Donald Trump exiting the White House, if it happens ever. Judge Juan Merchan, who presided over this case, the Stormy Daniels case, says that he now is going to go away and consider a motion by Trump's lawyers to dismiss the case and essentially drop the conviction, the 34 felony convictions. And while he's going away to consider all of that, he is postponing the sentencing of Donald Trump in connection with those 34 convictions indefinitely. There are many observers that believe that either this case will simply wither on the vine and those felony convictions will be overturned. Donald Trump, therefore, will no longer be a convicted felon, or, best case scenario for Donald Trump's detractors, this becomes an issue that he faces after he exits the White House, at which point sentencing might be passed.
Simon Marks, thank you as always for joining us. You're listening to The Daily. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. We may see at least one unhorsed president and sore loser who encouraged a coup to overturn an election actually answer for their actions. Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and a bevy of his cronies have been formally indicted over the events of January 8th, 2023, when Bolsonaro's supporters stormed several government buildings in Brasilia, gripped by the unevidenced conviction that the election their man had lost had been a fix. I'm joined with more on this by Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, first of all, do we know how much trouble Bolsonaro is potentially in here?
He is in a lot of trouble, Andrew. And even before that, let's remind our listeners that he's unelectable until 2030, according to Brazilian justice. Things change, That's the problem with Brazilian politics. It is an ongoing story. But with that, of course, we're waiting. The police forwarded all those documents to the court. The prosecutor will decide if he will press charges or not, to go to the Supreme Court next year. But if it all goes through, he could spend 28 years in prison and be unelectable for 30 years. Which, let's be honest, he's already, a fairly old man. He's 69 at the moment. So he's very, very much in trouble. But at the same time, he's still very strong. The local elections, his party, did okay, did better than expected by some, so he still is very powerful among his supporters.
Because just as people obviously contrasted the events of January 8th, 2023 with the events of January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C., is it possible we see a similar dynamic here? It's fairly clear that in the US, President-elect Donald Trump's criminal convictions and other charges have clearly done him no harm, and may actually have been a political asset to him. Is Bolsonaro trying to leverage this the same way as sort of proof that I am standing up against the establishment, they're all out to get me, etc.?
There will be a little bit of this, but for example, there's no street protest planned, at least at the moment, from what I can see. So, and let's remind that I did say that Bolsonaro did well in the local elections, but there was also right-wing parties that are not necessarily Bolsonaristas that also did well. And I think that's the difference between Brazil and the US, because the US, let's be honest, is two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. In Brazil, it's very different. We have 30 political parties. Of course, Bolsonaro is a powerful figure. He could potentially become president again. You never know. But it is different. He doesn't have control of a massive party like the Republican Party. And there are some people on the right that want to distance themselves of Bolsonaro because, Bolsonaro, for some, even if you're kind of a centrist, a little bit center-right, you wouldn't vote for someone like Bolsonaro. So it is very different in the US in a positive way, I have to say.
But is there around Bolsonaro a cult of personality like there is around Donald Trump, not merely just among voters, but among the political classes, as we see in the United States? People who would not excuse or countenance behaviour that Donald Trump has absolutely, definitely participated in from anybody else will tie themselves in knots trying to excuse it when Donald Trump does it.
Less so, I have to say. But listen, Bolsonaro has a lot of kids. And they are politicians, they're senators, they're MPs. So even if something happens to Bolsonaro, there will be a Bolsonaro legacy literally in the blood, with all his kids or even his wife, Michelle Bolsonaro. Sometimes they do those polls and apparently Michelle Bolsonaro would be one of the ones that could potentially beat Lula. So it is a little bit less than Trump, in my view. As I said, a lot of people from the right are starting to distance themselves. And let's be honest, we're looking here a lot of murky stuff. I think you might even mention that earlier this week, the federal police, they found out a plot to kill Lula, his vice president, and a Supreme Court judge. And four people have been arrested for that. And they were very close to the Bolsonaro government, in a way. So
the people arrested are soldiers and a police officer, which is concerning.
Very concerning. And now it's being reported in the Brazilian press that Bolsonaro knew about the plot. Of course, how much he knew, all the details, I think it's about to be seen. But that goes to a different sphere, even of what we see with Trump, in a way. That becomes like, oh my God, so Lula actually could have potentially been dead, and other things. So I think it's very serious. So of course the police is looking into that. We have to wait and see. But it is a really troubling period, I have to say.
Well, obviously, but how nervous are Brazilian authorities going to be about the prospect of further disturbances attached to this? Because if this process does go all the way through, there will be obvious flashpoints. There will be Bolsonaro appearing in court. There may be Bolsonaro convicted in court. And there may, as you said, be Bolsonaro sent to prison for the rest of his natural life. Does he still have that kind of fervent following that will keep turning up at all these things? Or is there a sense, even among his supporters, that he's probably yesterday's man at this point?
Well, and you did mention something very interesting as well, because you might ask, is the Brazilian Supreme Court politicized? Some people might arguably say that, yes, it is. I personally don't think it is, but it is a debatable topic. So I think if he's being judged by such Supreme Court, including some judges that Bolsonaro completely hates, is his mortal enemy, that will be a bit odd for his supporters. They'll say, listen, this is not fair with Bolsonaro. So that's my only concern. So I trust the Brazilian judicial system, but it will be a bit complicated telling his supporters that. And, talking about Trump again, I have to say, when Trump won, that was amazing news for Bolsonaro. Of course, we have those news, so I think that changes things a little bit. But let's not forget, when you have, Trump back in power, that will be hugely beneficial for someone like Bolsonaro. And I wonder how this will kind of influence, the whole process in a way.
So just finally, are we clear on what the next step is? It's obviously, this is not going to happen quickly, is it?
It's not going to happen quickly, but it's not going to take too long as well, because I read that the Supreme Court, they don't want to judge this, for example, in 2026, when it's the electoral year. So they want to get this done by next year. If it goes ahead, we're not sure about that yet. So I think they certainly don't want to make this kind of do something in the middle of an electoral year. And I think that's wise to say.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you for joining us. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and on a newsstand near you now about is the latest edition of The Entrepreneurs, Monocle's annual survey and indeed celebration of the entrepreneurial. Joining me from Toronto to tell us what's in it is Tomos Lewis, Monocle's Toronto correspondent. Tomos, I cannot help but notice, reviewing the table of contents, that there is a story here from Wales. Did you have something to do with this?
Oh gosh, you're a sleuth, Andrew. You really are. Yes, all the fingers point in my direction, and quite rightly so. There was a story in Wales about one of our most storied woolen mills, would you believe? And a lovely story actually, because it's such a familiar part of sort of growing up here. They make some of the most distinctive woolen, some of the most distinctive patterns, I should say, of woolen blankets. Have done so since the 19th century, and they just changed their business model. The family owners, they decided to retire. They didn't have their own children to pass it on to, so they decided to create a cooperative, so it's now effectively owned by the millers and the other people who work in the mill in a very picturesque part of Wales. So yes, that was on me, Andrew, that one.
I mean, it does sound like an altogether idyllic setup, both in terms of location and corporate structure. Are they making a decent living?
They are. They really are. They have done for some time now. For any sort of long-standing family-run company, of course, there are lots of chapters to the story, Andrew, and lots of iterations to the company as well. And speaking to Avion, the current owner, or now he's part of this cooperative now, given that they have retired, was saying that it was sort of in the 90s they tried to revive the brand as a kind of a premium fabric maker, if you like, given that everything is still handmade in the little mill in rural West Wales. And it was customers in places like Japan, actually, who were really beguiled by how long this family story was and just how painstaking the technique is of making these throws and these blankets and other things by this stage. And that's where they sort of slightly revived the business, this new chapter of the business. And now if you go to sort of nicer sort of stately homes or hotels or other businesses, you'll see the patterns of Melyn Llygwynt's blankets pretty frequently. And they're a very sort of treasured part of the sort of national identity here in Wales. So I was quite happy to fly the flag, not to mix the metaphors there, Andrew, but for this edition of The Entrepreneurs.
Listeners to The Entrepreneurs, the radio show, as opposed to purchasers, and I'm sure all our listeners are imminent purchasers of The Entrepreneurs, the magazine, will also know that you've been talking to people about how to open a hotel.
I have indeed, Andrew, and I met while I was there. I sort of lived temporarily in Havana earlier this year for a month or two, and I met Andres Levine, who is a really interesting character. He's Venezuelan American. He's a musician, a producer, and does lots of other things in between, and is now a hotelier as well. And it's interesting. Obviously, Havana, I think, welcomes about 1 million visitors each year, and tourism is really the pillar of the economy, particularly as other parts of the economy have struggled in recent years as geopolitics has changed, and also following the pandemic as well. But they restored this really beautiful 1930s apartment building, and I was just walking through the neighbourhood one Sunday morning. I heard this piano sort of quite romantically slipping out into the street, so I popped in, and then the rest is in the issue of the magazine. But he decided to open this hotel in an area that's sort of a bit overlooked by lots of people who visit Havana. It's sort of wedged between the Dado, the sort of artistic district, and the famous UNESCO World Heritage Old City of Havana. And so you sort of pass through it usually, but they wanted to create this place where the community had a music venue, for example, to showcase their musical skills and other artistic endeavours, and a cafe where the neighbourhood could come and linger and gather, as well as sort of hosting guests, obviously, in the 11 rooms that the hotel has. And they furnished it. Cuba has such a rich pedigree of sort of antiques and these stately homes and things over its history, so they've tracked down all of these pieces of furniture from different parts of the country. So it's a really lovely, homely experience that really feels like it's got lots of bits of Cuba's history, all sort of nestled within the walls. So yes, it was a lovely story to be able to sort of dig into and to hear more about, Andrew.
There's also at least one slightly meta story in that we interview somebody who runs one of the establishments which should be, at least I hope is, actually stocking the Entrepreneurs on its shelves.
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking of getting in touch with her today, actually, to say that, we would send her a copy. But I was like, well, she's probably got a stack of copies already. Yes, this is a story, Andrew, about the newest magazine shop in Toronto. It's called Issues. It opened, I guess, close to 2 years ago now. And they've just opened a second location, the east end of the city. And Nicola Hamilton is the founder, and she's another very interesting character. She was a creative director for lots of Canadian magazines, won awards for her work. And she decided to make the switch from designing them to selling them. And I thought one of the pieces of advice that she was given that stuck out to me, Andrew, was that, when starting this magazine shop, she'd never sort of been in the retail space before, that she was advised to pick out 5 copies each of the magazines she wanted to sell, see how they sold, and then build the inventory from there. So from having been to the shop when it first opened to going there now, there's stacks and stacks of magazines everywhere. And she's turned it into this sort of neighborhood hub as well, which is, pretty hard to sort of squeeze into some of these events she hosts, all centered around the sort of print world, is really quite something, and a really lovely addition to the neighborhood, not far from the Monocle shop, I should say, in the west end of Toronto.
Well, just to follow that up, Thomas, it does sound like a huge vote of confidence in the idea of print, which regular listeners and readers of Monocle stuff will be well aware is something we share. But clearly they're optimistic about the future of print. I mean, opening any business is an expression of optimism, but they still think that people are going to want to buy something they can carry around with them and flip through.
Absolutely, and people are buying, lots of the magazines and the other sort of printed goods that she is selling through Issues, her magazine shop, Andrew. And I think what's so interesting and what's kind of a nice approach that she's taken is that, they sell the weekend papers, for example, so you have a bit of a captive audience there. But there's such a rich sort of ecosystem of indie magazines in Canada. There's a big printing press in Vancouver, just outside Vancouver, which prints a lot of these indies. That itself is family run as well, I believe. But what you've got then is this mix of people who are maybe trying to create their first magazine, or trying to create a magazine about an issue that isn't that catered to in Canada, next to some of the big titles that are sort of guaranteed to bring people through the door. And then mix with that with sort of talks from magazine editors or publishers, as well as people passing through. And she's been doing these pop-up print events around the country as well. Again, very well attended, people still very much wanting to, as you say, Andrew, pick up a copy, take it home with them, and to leaf through it at their leisure. So no, Sabina, it's a really lovely story, and she's made a great success of it in Toronto.
Tomos Lewis, thanks for joining us. A reminder that what we were talking about there, The Entrepreneurs, is out more or less now and should be on a newsstand near you as we speak. You could, of course, also subscribe to Monocle via our website at monocle.com. Finally, on today's show, China's emergence from slumbering rural backwater into modern superpower has happened astonishingly quickly. As recently as 1995, China's economy was about 2/3 the size of Italy's. The story of China's transformation is told in a new book by Oriana Skylar Mastro, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power. I spoke to Oriana earlier and began by asking her about the speed at which China has grown.
I think if you go back to the 2000s and look through commentaries of pundits, there was a big discussion about what the next great power was going to be. And there were equal votes cast for countries like Brazil, India, even the European Union. So it wasn't sort of inevitable or a set path that everyone knew we were going to be here in 2024 in a great power competition between the United States and China.
I mean, did anybody see it coming at all? Were there people trying to say at the time and who are now saying, well, I told you so?
Well, yes, of course, you always have those people who say, well, I told you so. Well, one of the things I try to point out in the book is that getting the details right is really important. We tend to mischaracterize often what China is doing. So if you go back 20 years, of course, you have people that, we refer to as great power theorists who always talk about competition between great powers. And they would have pointed out, China is going to be a problem in 20 years. They're going to grow. It's a natural state of competition between China and the United States. But, those types of predictions are kind of like when you go to a psychic and they're like, oh, I see. And in your future, it's like they're so generalized. And that actually what the book really points out is how China did this, how China built political and military power in particular, but also aspects of their economic power was not how we predicted it, because in many cases it was very different than what the United States had done previously. And so it isn't so simple to say, should the United States have engaged with China, not engaged with China type of dichotomy that you hear a lot today. It's much more complex, because the Chinese, the whole upstart strategy I talk about in the book, is how agile and flexible they are to adapt to the strategic environment, vulnerabilities and weaknesses that they have, that the United States has, and to cater to their competitive advantages and try to avoid the traps of direct competition with the United States, where the United States feels the most comfortable.
Your book does get into this, and it does make a case that we are looking at something new in terms of what we think of as a great power, because it doesn't, the People's Republic, that is, doesn't really have allies in the way that the United States does. It doesn't even really quite have clients like the Soviet Union did. Was that always part of the plan, or have they kind of evolved here even semi-accidentally?
So at least in the alliance sense, that was always part of the plan. So in the 1990s, part of what I try to do in the book, besides laying out the areas where China acts similarly or differently than the United States, is to really leverage, thousands of Chinese sources to explain why. What was the debate? What was the logic behind certain decisions? In the case of alliances, it's very simple. I mean, the Chinese do understand that that is a very effective strategy for the United States. It's also the case that the United States is trying to project power globally. So alliances becomes necessary because the United States needs bases all around the world. China is not projecting military power globally, so alliances in that case are less needed. But it's also that they sort of assess the United States as all the best allies. And they write very openly, okay, what does that mean? We get like Russia and Iran, and the costs of alienating U.S. allies and partners were not worth whatever gains they were going to get, militarily, politically, economically, from creating those blocks. And so it was a deliberate part of the strategy to maintain positive relations with the United States and its allies, not to create this alternative vision.
I mean, do you find any indication, though, that China, for all that it is an enormously important part of all our lives now, is still quite an opaque construct? There's a lot we don't know and don't understand about what goes on inside the Communist Party. Do you run across any indications that maybe it's not as great a power as it might look, that they might be somewhat over-egging their economic statistics, that the CCP might not be as stable as it would like everyone to think it is?
Well, let me just say, of course, China is so opaque. And this is an issue not only as a China specialist, as a professor at Stanford, as I'm advising students in the future field, especially with COVID. It's so hard now to convince people to study China because it's harder to do field work in China. Technically, asking questions about national security is illegal now in China. You couple that with the great power competition with the United States, people who want to work in government or in policy are also wary about engagements with China. And then the Chinese are very opaque. So all this on top of each other. I'm not hubristic enough to say, listen, 100%, I know everything there is to know about China. I think what I try to do is look at what the Chinese say, what they build, and how they act. So discourse, behavior, and capabilities. And where those things point me in one direction, then I'm pretty confident, okay, this is, what the Chinese are doing. When they're kind of a mix, like the Chinese say one thing, do another thing, then you have less confidence. To your question of the future of the Communist Party, on the outside, it does look very stable. I mean, I see, as a military specialist, I see the CCP's control over the military as steadfast. I see their ability to control and regulate information descent within their borders to be exceptional. Like, that's not a normative judgment, just in terms of the fact this is a huge country of billions of people, and the amount of instability and unrest that they, have and how they deal with it has been, pretty swift. But on the other hand, Xi Jinping constantly goes to the military to make speeches about how they need to be loyal to him and not overthrow him. So, why is that so important for him to say over and over and over again if there's no threat of it? But for the sake of understanding China's strategy and where China's role in the world is going, China would really have to change direction completely to not be a great power in the future, to not be, a challenge whose interests and preferences other countries are accommodating in the future, right? They've been the number one exporter since 2009. when the United States was competing with the Soviet Union had half the GDP of the United States, right? That's not the case with China. And China is not extending themselves the same way the Soviet Union is.
Well, just finally, and as an extension of that thought, does its future trajectory strike you as basically predictable? Because it strikes me, at least, and this is very far from an expert opinion, that for all that China has transformed itself radically in quite a short space of time, as your book demonstrates, they've also been quite cautious. You don't see them, at least not yet, touch wood, doing things like the equivalent of invading Ukraine or trying to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy. They're not big on the great big sharp shock.
Right, exactly. So those two cases are ones I write about in the book. China does not engage in foreign military intervention, and they don't prefer certain types of regimes. They're not trying to autocratize countries the way that the United States is trying to democratize countries. They're sort of regime agnostic when it comes to their interactions. One of the useful things about this Upstart framework is it gives us some insight over what will change in the future and what will stay the same based on China's trajectory of power. So in the conclusion of the book, I look at the next 25 years and say, basically, given trends, given the fact that the balance of power is going to change, the international system is changing, how can we expect China to act in the next 25 years? And one big difference than how they've acted the past 25 years is the fact that not threatening the United States used to be a primary consideration. They would assess a strategy and think, okay, if I emulate this, will the United States find it threatening or reassuring? In some cases, like participation in peacekeeping operations, joining international institutions, engaging in free trade, reassuring, right? So China did those things. Other things, especially on the military side, they didn't do because they were threatening. But now the Chinese have assessed we're in this competition. The United States is, threatened. That consideration is going to have less of pride of place than it did the past 25 years.
That was Oriana Skylar Mastro. Her book Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, is available now and very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Simon Marks, Fernando, Augusto, Pacheco and Tomos Lewis. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend.